Picture this. A young woman jolted awake in complete darkness, hands grabbing her from sleep, no explanation, no mercy. What happens next will make your blood run cold, because this isn't just another history lesson. This is about the night 280 women were sewn into sacks and drowned in the Bosphorus, and the twisted empire that made it possible. The summer night of 1647 started like any other inside the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. Isa, barely 20 years old, had been ripped from her Circassian village when she was just 12, sold at a Cairo market like livestock, shipped across the Mediterranean, and delivered into the Sultan's service. 8 years she lived behind those palace walls. 8 years without ever stepping beyond them, without ever tasting freedom. When the eunuch's hand shook her awake that night, his face was expressionless, empty. He told her to get up, told her to dress, but he wouldn't tell her why. She followed him into the corridor and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. The hallway was packed with women, dozens of them, all moving in the same direction, their bare feet silent against the cold tile. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The air was thick with rose water and the smoky scent of oil lamps. But underneath it all was something more ancient, that mineral smell of stone that had never known sunlight, never felt the warmth of day. She recognized the faces around her. Layla, just 17, a Georgian girl who played the ney flute so beautifully the Sultan himself had applauded her performance. Fatma, 23, who'd given the Sultan a daughter and been rewarded with her own apartment and a salary her family back in Abkhazia would never learn about. Old Hadisi, who'd survived since the previous Sultan's reign, and now spent her days washing linens in the lower quarters. All of them walking in silence toward the courtyard, and not a single one had been told why they were being summoned in the dead of night. When they reached the courtyard, more eunuchs were waiting. They stood in 2 rigid rows, creating a pathway toward the outer gate, the gate that opened onto the terrace overlooking the Bosphorus Strait. Isa had never passed through that gate. No harem woman ever did unless she was being transferred or released, and transfers always happened in broad daylight with proper ceremony. This was the middle of the night. Then she saw it. Canvas sacks, dozens of them stacked against the wall, each one large enough to hold a human body. Beside them, coils of rope. Beside the rope, heavy river stones, each the size of a man's head, arranged in neat, deliberate rows as if someone had spent hours preparing them with care. If you're watching from New York, London, Istanbul, or anywhere else in the world, drop your city in the comments right now, because you need to subscribe to Sinister Empires. This story is about to get so much darker, and you won't believe where it goes. The blood drained from Isa's face. She understood now. She understood why the eunuch's expression had been so carefully blank, why nobody was speaking, why they'd been woken in darkness instead of summoned in daylight like usual. The women around her were beginning to understand too. She could hear their breathing change, that ragged, desperate sound of realization hitting them all at once. They hadn't been woken for a ceremony. They hadn't been woken for a transfer or even a punishment. They had been woken to die. At the far end of the courtyard, past the sacks and stones and coils of rope, stood the Kisler Aga, the chief black eunuch of the Ottoman Empire. He was the 3rd most powerful official in the entire government, the man who controlled every entrance and exit of the harem, the man who decided which women the Sultan would see, and which women would simply disappear. In his hands, he held a needle and thread. He would personally sew the first sack shut himself. But before I tell you what happened in that courtyard, before I describe the horror that unfolded on that summer night, you need to understand how we got here. Because what the Ottoman sultans did to the women trapped inside their harems wasn't just one act of madness by one deranged ruler. This was a system, carefully built over centuries, maintained by an empire, enforced by tradition and terror. And the night Isa was shaken awake wasn't the beginning of this nightmare. It was the end of it. If you think you know how the Ottoman harem actually worked, this video is going to completely change your mind. You're about to learn how young girls were kidnapped from their villages across Europe and Asia, sold into the Sultan's household like property, and trained for years in nothing but obedience. How princes were locked away in golden cages with women who had been deliberately sterilized to ensure they could never bear children. How the most powerful women in the empire poisoned and strangled each other just to survive in a system that gave them exactly one path to power, and that path ran through rivers of blood. And you're going to learn how one sultan, a man driven completely insane by 17 years of imprisonment, gave the order that resulted in 280 women being sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait on a single night. If this is the kind of history they never taught you in school, the kind they deliberately left out of the textbooks, you need to understand the full truth. To grasp how a system this monstrous could exist, how it could function for generations, you need to understand the man at the center of it all. Sultan Ibrahim I was born in Constantinople on November 5, 1615, the youngest son of Sultan Ahmed I and his consort, Kozum Sultan. Kozum was Greek by birth, originally named Anastasia. Sold into the harem as a young girl, and through raw intelligence and absolute ruthlessness, she rose to become one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. She bore Ahmed multiple sons, and this was simultaneously her greatest achievement and the source of everything that would follow, everything that would lead to that terrible night in 1647. In the Ottoman Empire, there was no law of primogeniture, no rule of the eldest son inheriting the throne. Every son of the Sultan had equal claim to power. When a Sultan died, his sons didn't negotiate. They didn't compromise. They fought, and the winner would strangle the losers with a silk bowstring, because spilling royal blood was strictly forbidden by tradition. Make sure you hit that like button and share this video, because what comes next is going to blow your mind. This is Sinister Empires, and we're just getting started. Sultan Mehmed III had done the unthinkable back in 1595. He executed 19 of his own brothers in a single day. Some of them were infants, carried to the executioner in the arms of their own nurses, women who had cared for them since birth. The silk cord was a chosen instrument of royal death throughout the Ottoman world. It was thin, impossibly strong, and it left no visible wound on the body, no mark of violence. The executioners themselves were deaf mutes, selected specifically because they couldn't hear the screams of dying princes and couldn't repeat what they witnessed in those final, terrible moments. To break the cycle of mass fratricide, to end the rivers of royal blood flowing through palace corridors, Sultan Ahmed I introduced a radical new system in 1603. Instead of killing rival princes outright, he would lock them away where they couldn't threaten the throne. He called it the caves, the cage. It was a suite of rooms buried deep within a harem at Topkapi Palace, decorated with painted ceilings and stained glass windows that filtered sunlight into intricate patterns of blue and gold. It was furnished with silk divans and embroidered textiles worth small fortunes. Guards, eunuchs who stood motionless outside the single entrance, watched it every hour of every day, without exception. From the outside, it looked like a palace apartment fit for royalty. But it functioned as a prison, and everyone knew it. Princes entered the caves as young as 7 or 8 years old, and remained there until one of two things happened. Either they ascended the throne, or they died of old age, having never tasted freedom. Some spent entire decades locked inside those beautiful rooms. When Sultan Suleiman II was finally released from the caves in 1687, after 36 years of continuous confinement, his first words weren't gratitude or relief. They were a question laced with terror. If my death has been commanded, say so. Since my childhood, I have suffered 40 years of imprisonment. He genuinely didn't believe freedom was real. He assumed it was an elaborate trick, one final cruelty before the executioners came for him. The princes trapped in the cage were given tutors to educate them, servants to attend their needs, and food delivered fresh from the imperial kitchens. They were also given concubines for companionship, but there was a horrifying catch. Only women who had been medically confirmed as barren were permitted inside, because a prince in a cage could never, under any circumstances, be allowed to father children. A rival heir with a son of his own could threaten the entire dynasty. The concubines in the cave served a dual purpose in this twisted system. They provided companionship for men who had virtually no other human contact with the outside world, and they kept the princes sexually occupied so they wouldn't spend their days plotting rebellion or scheming for power. These women never left the caves either. They were prisoners just like the princes. If one somehow became pregnant despite being specifically chosen for her infertility, the punishment was immediate and absolute. She was drowned in the Bosphorus by the eunuchs that very day. No trial, no investigation, no questions asked. The eunuchs enforced this rule without exception, without hesitation, without mercy. Ibrahim entered the caves at just 8 years old when his older brother Murad IV seized the throne in 1623. Murad was a study in contradictions. He was brilliant, absolutely violent, and a severe alcoholic. He banned both coffee and alcohol throughout the entire empire and personally executed anyone caught drinking, despite being a raging alcoholic himself. The hypocrisy was staggering. He once cut off the head of a musician who had the misfortune of playing a Persian melody he didn't like. He forced harem women to jump into a pool for his entertainment, and then fired lead pellets at their bodies as they swam. He had a group of singing women drown in the Bosphorus because their voices disturbed his peace one evening. Drowning was already the standard punishment for women who angered the Sultan. This is crucial to understand. Ibrahim didn't invent this method of execution. He inherited it from a long line of predecessors who had normalized it over generations. And one by one, over the years of his reign, Murad systematically strangled his own brothers. He killed them in birth order, youngest to oldest, using that same silk cord that Ottoman custom had prescribed for centuries. Each time Ibrahim heard the footsteps of executioners passing outside his door in the caves, he had no way of knowing whether they were coming for the brother next in line or whether this time, finally, they were coming for him. By the time Murad was finished with his purge, Ibrahim was the only male of the Ottoman dynasty left breathing. He was the last one. He'd been spared, but not out of mercy or brotherly love. He was spared purely out of cold necessity. If Ibrahim died, the 600-year-old Ottoman dynasty would end completely. Murad needed a spare heir, a backup plan. But Ibrahim had no way of knowing he was safe. He had no information, no reassurance, no guarantee. Every single morning, he woke up inside those beautiful painted rooms wondering if today would be the day the door opened to reveal a eunuch holding that silk cord with his name on it. Every night, he fell asleep knowing that his brother's mood could change at any moment, that a bad day or a drunken rage could mean his death. The psychological torture was relentless. He began feeding fish in the palace pool with gold coins instead of food, convinced the coins would somehow sustain them. He talked to walls as if they could hear him and respond. He screamed at shadows that weren't there. Ibrahim spent 17 years in the caves. 17 years trapped behind walls he couldn't leave, surrounded by guards who watched and documented his every single movement, attended only by sterilized women and castrated men, knowing that the only thing keeping him alive was the slim possibility that he might someday be useful to his brother. Modern psychologists who study the devastating effects of prolonged solitary confinement have documented something terrifying. Isolation lasting more than just 15 days can produce vivid hallucinations, chronic anxiety disorders, and permanent, irreversible changes to brain structure. Ibrahim didn't endure 15 days. He endured 17 years of the psychological hell. His contemporaries, the people who witnessed what he became, had a much simpler term for the result of all that torture. They called him mad. When Murad finally died of cirrhosis at just 27 years old in 1640, the Grand Vizier came to Ibrahim's door to deliver the news that should have been joyous. He was now Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, ruler of one of the world's most powerful kingdoms. Ibrahim refused to believe it. He was convinced it was a trick, the final cruel game his brother would play before the silk cord finally tightened around his throat. He barricaded himself inside the caves, pushing heavy furniture against the door with desperate strength, and he absolutely would not come out. His mother Kozum came to the door and spoke to him through the thick wood, begging him to open it, to accept his destiny. He refused. Palace guards came with assurances. He refused them too. Government ministers arrived, explaining that the empire needed him. He still refused. It was only when palace officials finally carried Murad's actual corpse through the corridors of the harem and laid it directly outside Ibrahim's barricaded door, positioning it where he could inspect it through a crack in the wood, that he finally, slowly, cautiously opened the door. He touched the dead body with his own trembling hands, needing to confirm with his own senses that it was real, that this wasn't some elaborate deception. He was 24 years old. He had spent more than 2/3 of his entire life locked in a cage, isolated from the world, watching his brothers die one by one. And now, suddenly, he controlled an empire that stretched from Baghdad all the way to Vienna. He commanded an army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He had access to a treasury that funded wars across 3 continents. And he had a harem containing nearly 300 women whose bodies and lives belonged entirely to him, to do with as he pleased. The historian Noel Barber wrote that once on the throne, Ibrahim proved to be the most detestable and debauched of all the Ottoman sultans in the dynasty's long history. But some modern historians, including Scott Rank, have suggested a different interpretation. They argue that Ibrahim's political opponents deliberately spread exaggerated rumors of insanity to justify his eventual deposition, and that he may have been more incompetent than truly mad. The distinction matters less than you might think when you consider the consequences. Whether Ibrahim was clinically insane or merely psychologically shattered beyond any hope of repair by decades of unrelenting trauma, the result for the women trapped in his harem was exactly the same: suffering, terror, death. The women in that harem didn't arrive by choice. Nobody volunteered for this life. Young girls of extraordinary beauty were sent to the Sultan's court as gifts from provincial governors desperately seeking favor and promotions. Most were Caucasian, Georgian, or Abkhazian, taken from remote villages in the mountain regions between the Black Sea and the Caspian. They were bought at slave markets after being kidnapped from their families by armed raiders who swept through villages in the night, or they were sold by parents too desperately poor to feed them during famines and droughts. The slave caravans moved slowly through the Caucasus Mountains and across the dangerous Black Sea to Constantinople, and the brutal journey killed many of the girls before they ever arrived at the palace. Those who survived the voyage were immediately inspected upon arrival at the palace by the Valide Sultan herself, the Sultan's mother, or by senior harem women acting directly on her behalf. Girls who arrived at Topkapi were sorted into a rigid hierarchy that would define every single day of the rest of their lives. Those considered plain or unremarkable became Kurii, the lowest rank in the harem's brutal social structure. They were servant girls who cleaned, cooked, and laundered for the women ranked above them. They lived in large, crowded dormitories beneath the luxurious apartments of the consorts and slept on thin mats spread across cold stone floors. Those considered beautiful, however, were placed on an entirely different track. They became potential concubines, and their intensive training began immediately, often within hours of their arrival. They learned Turkish, if they didn't already speak it fluently. They memorized long passages of the Quran by heart. They were taught to belly dance with perfect rhythm and grace. They learned to recite classical Persian poetry from memory without a single mistake. They mastered instruments like the oud, the ney flute, and the cannon. They studied elaborate court etiquette under the strict supervision of the Kayakaden, the head stewardess who enforced discipline with brutal beatings for any infraction, no matter how minor. They were taught what the Ottoman sources delicately called the arts of companionship, a comprehensive set of skills specifically designed to please the Sultan in his private chambers. The training process took years to complete. A girl might enter the harem at 12 years old and not be formally presented to the Sultan until she was 18 or 20, by which time she had been completely transformed from a kidnapped village child into a polished, multilingual, musically accomplished woman whose entire identity had been systematically rebuilt around one singular purpose: the possibility that the Sultan might notice her. If the Sultan took a girl to his bed, her status changed overnight in the most dramatic way imaginable. She received her own private chamber, her own personal servants, her own dedicated kitchen staff, a personal eunuch assigned exclusively to attend her needs, and a generous salary paid directly from the imperial treasury. If she became pregnant, she was immediately moved to larger, more luxurious apartments. If she bore a son, she became one of the most powerful people in the entire empire because her son might one day sit on a throne and rule millions. And if he did ascend to power, she would rule beside him as Valide Sultan, wielding enormous political influence. If she bore a son and that son eventually became Sultan, she became the queen mother, the supreme authority within a harem with absolute power over life and death for every single woman inside its walls. This created a system where women had exactly one path to power, and that path ran directly through the Sultan's bedroom. There was no alternative route. The competition was lethal because it had to be in a world where your son's survival depended entirely on your political influence, and your influence depended entirely on maintaining the Sultan's favor. Every other woman who shared his bed wasn't just a rival. She was an existential threat to you and everything you'd built. Harem history is absolutely filled with women who clawed their way to the top through violence and destroyed anyone who threatened their position. Mahdiran Sultana attacked her rival Harem Sultana with her fingernails, tearing gashes so deep across her face they left permanent, disfiguring scars. Gulbahar Sultana pushed a competing concubine named Gulbayaz off a cliff to her death. Harem Sultana was strangled in her own chambers by assassins. Besmi-Alam Sultana vanished one day and was never seen again. Her body was never found. Her fate was never explained. Nobody asked questions. Every glass of sherbet offered in the harem was potentially poisoned with arsenic or belladonna. Every friendship was potentially a carefully constructed trap. Every woman who smiled at you and offered kindness might be the same woman secretly arranging your death behind closed doors. Now think carefully about what happens when you place a man who spent 17 years in solitary confinement, who watched his brothers be systematically murdered one by one, who suffers from what modern clinicians would immediately recognize as severe psychological damage, at the absolute center of this brutal system with no checks on his behavior whatsoever. Even before Ibrahim reached his absolute worst, before the night that would define his reign in blood, the drowning system was already fully operational in his household. Early in his reign, while he was still a prince confined to the caves, a Georgian concubine named Semsisa became pregnant in direct violation of harem rules. Kozum Sultan ordered the Kisler Aga, a eunuch named Sumbul Aga, to drown her immediately. Instead, Sumbul made a fateful decision. He hid Semsisa in his own quarters where she secretly gave birth to a son named Osman. When Kozum eventually discovered this deception, she was furious. She exiled all three of them to Egypt, hoping distance would solve the problem. But their ship was attacked by the Knights of Malta during the voyage, and Semsisa and her son were captured. Semsisa died in captivity, probably from disease or mistreatment. Her son was raised Christian on the island of Malta under the name Domenico Ottomano, an Ottoman prince who grew up in a foreign country, never knowing the father who had been locked in a cage or the grandmother who had casually ordered his mother drowned. This was the system working normally. This was what passed for routine in the Ottoman harem. No one questioned it. Ibrahim's mother Kozum actively encouraged him to spend as much time as possible in the harem, and she had very calculated reasons for this. It served two critical purposes. First, it kept Ibrahim distracted and completely out of state affairs, which Kozum strongly preferred to manage herself from behind the scenes. Second, it ensured that Ibrahim fathered heirs, which was absolutely critical because he was the last surviving male of the Ottoman line. If he died without sons, 600 years of dynasty ended completely. Kozum personally went to the slave markets herself to select girls she thought would hold her son's attention and keep him occupied. She knew his preferences intimately. She studied what kept him calm and what triggered his violent rages. She curated a harem around him like a handler carefully managing a dangerous, unpredictable animal. But the harem wasn't managed by Kozum alone. The machinery of daily control, the enforcement of rules, the punishment of infractions, all of that belonged to the eunuchs. And understanding the eunuch system is absolutely essential to understanding how the harem functioned, because these were the men who would ultimately carry out the mass drownings. The eunuchs of the Ottoman harem were boys taken from East Africa, primarily from Abyssinia, Nubia, and the Upper Nile Valley region. They were captured through violent slave raids at around 7 or 8 years old, transported by caravan to the brutal desert of Sudan to Cairo, and castrated there by specialized operators, often Coptic monks who performed the procedure as a grotesque side business. The procedure involved complete removal of everything, and the mortality rate was absolutely catastrophic. Historians estimate that only 10 to 20% of boys actually survived the operation. The rest died from shock, blood loss, or infection. Those who somehow lived through it were healed over several agonizing months and then shipped to Constantinople, where their rarity and the horror of what they'd endured made them extraordinarily valuable. At the top of this brutal hierarchy sat the Kisler Aga, the chief black eunuch, formerly titled the Aga of the House of Felicity. He held the rank of Pasha and was the third most powerful official in the entire Ottoman Empire, behind only the Sultan and the Grand Vizier. He controlled every single entrance and exit of the harem with absolute authority. He decided which women the Sultan saw, and when he saw them, he managed all the finances, supervised the education of the young princes, organized festivals and ceremonies, and served as the sole intermediary between the Grand Vizier and the Sultan himself. No minister, not even the Grand Vizier himself, could enter the harem without the Kisler Aga's explicit permission. At the peak of the system in the 17th century, the harem employed between 800 and 1,200 eunuchs. They stood guard at every door, watching, listening, controlling. They accompanied every woman who moved from one section of the harem to another. They listened to every conversation, monitoring for signs of conspiracy or rebellion. And when a woman violated the rules, it was the eunuchs who administered punishment without hesitation. For lesser offenses, brutal beatings. For serious offenses, permanent exile. For the gravest offense of all, drowning in the cold waters of the Bosphorus Strait. It was the Kisler Aga himself who personally sewed the first sack shut. Ibrahim took to the harem with an intensity that disturbed even his most experienced handlers. He was reputed to take 24 different concubines in a single day, moving from chamber to chamber in a frenzy. Over the course of just 7 years, his concubines bore him 18 children. He had mirrors installed on the walls and ceilings of his private chambers, so he could watch himself during his encounters. The Moldavian chronicler Dimitri Cantemir, a soldier and statesman who documented Ottoman court life from direct observation, recorded something disturbing. Ibrahim would assemble all the women in the palace gardens, order them to strip completely naked, and then run among them, neighing like a stallion, acting out some deranged fantasy. He drenched palace furnishings in expensive ambergris perfume, which is known to cause dizziness and disorientation when concentrated in enclosed spaces. He adorned his beard with diamonds worth fortunes. He stuffed his pillows with rare sable fur. He once saw the hindquarters of a cow in the palace courtyard and was so taken with the shape that he had a golden cast made of it and sent it around the empire with specific instructions to find a woman whose body matched it exactly. He developed an all-consuming obsession with sable fur after one of his concubines told him a romantic story about a legendary sable king. Ibrahim immediately sent agents to every corner of the empire to bring back sable pelts. He lined entire palace walls with sable fur from floor to ceiling. He had cats dressed in tiny sable coats and paraded to the halls like living decorations. He carpeted the entire palace of Ibrahim Pasha in expensive sable and gave it as a gift to one of his wives, Teli Hasiki. The cost was absolutely staggering, paid from a treasury already severely strained by the ongoing war in Crete and a devastating Venetian naval blockade that was slowly starving Constantinople. But Ibrahim's most notorious obsession was with large women, particularly those of substantial size. He sent agents across the empire to search for its heaviest woman. His agent eventually found her, an Armenian from Constantinople named Sekerper, said to weigh over 300 pounds. Ibrahim became so completely infatuated with her that he elevated her to the extremely prestigious rank of a Sikhi sultan, showered her with wealth beyond what any concubine had received before in Ottoman history, and declared her governor-general of Damascus, giving a former slave direct administrative authority over one of the greatest cities in the entire Ottoman world. He gave her the land and jewels that had previously belonged to his own sisters, deliberately humiliating Ottoman princesses, women of royal blood, just to reward a woman he had purchased from a slave market. Ibrahim also once took a liking to the infant son of a slave woman, and began to openly prefer this completely unrelated child over his own firstborn son, Mehmed. When Mehmed's mother, Turin, complained about this insulting treatment, Ibrahim flew into a violent rage. He grabbed the toddler Mehmed from her arms and threw him into a pool. The child would have drowned if a quick-thinking servant hadn't pulled him out in time. Mehmed survived, but he carried a permanent scar on his forehead for the rest of his life. He was 3 years old. Sekreper, whom everyone in the palace called Sugar Cube, wasn't merely a favorite concubine. She was a skilled political operator who understood how to manipulate power. She whispered in Ibrahim's ear during the hours when his paranoia was at its strongest. In the early morning, when he woke up screaming from nightmares about the caliphs and his murdered brothers. In the late evening, when the thick ambergris perfume filled the air and his thoughts spiraled into dark places, she told him which women to trust and which women to fear. She told him secrets, real or invented, about other concubines and their supposed plots. And she weaponized Ibrahim's paranoia, the deep and permanent paranoia of a man who had spent his formative years expecting to be murdered at any moment, to systematically destroy anyone who threatened her position. When one concubine managed to draw the Sultan's attention, Sekreper made absolutely sure the attention didn't last long. When another gained influence or favor, Sekreper planted seeds of doubt in Ibrahim's mind. She wasn't the first woman in history to rule through the Sultan's ear rather than his bed. She was simply the most dangerous, because the Sultan she controlled was already psychologically broken beyond repair. Ibrahim raised 8 concubines simultaneously to the rank of a Sikhi, royal consort, something no Sultan had ever done before or would ever do again in the dynasty's history. The title had once been reserved for a single favorite woman, making it meaningful and powerful. Ibrahim debased it into a tool of extravagance, giving each of his 8 Hasikis land, wealth, servants, and political influence. He stripped his own sisters and nieces of their property to fund these lavish gifts. His mother, Kozum, watched this with growing alarm, not just because of the cost, although the financial cost was absolutely ruinous, but because Ibrahim's concubines were beginning to exercise real, tangible political power. They influenced the appointment of provincial governors. They interfered with critical military decisions. They answered to no one except Ibrahim, and Ibrahim answered to no one at all. Kozum had survived decades of brutal Ottoman court politics through intelligence and patience. She had outlived her husband, Ahmed. She had managed her son Murad's violent reign without being killed by it. She had kept Ibrahim alive in the caves when Murad wanted him dead. She understood, with the absolute clarity of a woman who had governed an empire from behind the walls of a harem, that the state could not be run by a man who lined rooms with fur and appointed concubines to provincial governorships. She also understood that Sekreper was the engine driving Ibrahim's worst impulses, fueling his paranoia and encouraging his most destructive behavior. So Kozum invited Sekreper to dinner. According to the English diplomat Paul Rycott, who documented Ottoman court life in extraordinary detail during this period, Kozum had Sekreper strangled during the meal itself. She then calmly told Ibrahim that Sugar Cube had died suddenly of a violent illness, food poisoning perhaps. Ibrahim was absolutely devastated. He mourned her for weeks, barely functioning. He refused food. He wept in his sable-lined chambers, surrounded by the furs she had convinced him to buy. But Sekreper's death didn't solve the problem. It made it catastrophically worse. With Sugar Cube gone, Ibrahim's paranoia had no filter, no direction, no target. There was no longer anyone whispering in his ear to direct his suspicions at specific targets. Instead, his suspicion turned everywhere at once. Spinning out of control, he became convinced that women throughout the harem were conspiring against him, plotting his death just like his brothers had been killed. He ordered investigations. He had women interrogated by the eunuchs. The eunuchs conducted the questioning under his direct orders, using methods that left bruises and worse. No one confessed because there was nothing to confess. There was no conspiracy. But Ibrahim couldn't accept that. And this is where the story returns to that courtyard on a summer night in Constantinople, to Isa and the canvas sacks and the river stones. Because Sekreper was gone, but the damage she had done lived on after her. Before her death, she had planted one final piece of poison in Ibrahim's mind. She told him that one of his concubines had been intimate with a man from outside the harem. She didn't say which one. She may not have actually known. She may have invented the entire story to keep Ibrahim dependent on her investigative abilities, never expecting that she would die before the matter was resolved. Ibrahim ordered the Kisler Aga to investigate immediately. Women were questioned under threat and under pain. None could identify the guilty party, because there may never have been one to begin with. Ibrahim's rage built for weeks, then months, growing more intense with each passing day. He interrogated women personally, demanding answers. He demanded names. He received none. The eunuchs reported failure after failure. The investigation turned the entire harem into a place of absolute terror, where every woman suspected every other woman of informing, and where the Sultan's shadow appearing in a corridor was enough to make a room fall completely silent. And then one night, he made his decision. He ordered every woman in his harem gathered in the courtyard, 280 of them, women he had taken to his bed, women who had borne his children, women who had spent years training in poetry and music and dance for the privilege of serving him, women who had been torn from their families as children and shipped across seas they would never cross again, women who had done nothing except exist inside a system they had never chosen to enter, all of them brought to the courtyard in darkness, barefoot on stone that was still warm from the day's heat. Some of them understood immediately what was happening. The women who had been in the harem longest, who had witnessed punishments before, who had seen the sacks used on individual women accused of specific crimes, recognized the signs. The moment they saw the canvas piled against the wall, they began to cry. Others stood in confusion, still half asleep, not yet comprehending why they had been woken in the middle of the night, or why the eunuchs who had dressed them and fed them and escorted them to the baths every morning were now standing in rigid military formation with their faces turned to stone. The youngest girls, some of them barely older than children, recent arrivals who had not yet finished their training, had never seen a drowning sack at all, and did not know what the canvas was for. The eunuchs had prepared everything in advance with careful precision. The sacks were canvas, large enough to contain a human body with room for the stones that would drag it to the bottom of the strait. The Kisler Aga, the chief black eunuch, the man who had overseen these women's daily lives for years, who had arranged their meals and supervised their education, and decided which ones the Sultan would see on any given night, who had managed their pregnancies and their illnesses and their arguments and their friendships, personally sewed the first sacks shut with a heavy needle and thread he carried specifically for this purpose. The other eunuchs followed his example. They had been trained for this. Drowning in the Bosphorus was the standard method of execution for women who violated harem law. What made this night different wasn't the method. It was the scale. Each woman was placed inside a sack. Stones were added, heavy river stones, each one the size of a man's head, enough weight to ensure the sack would not float. The sack was sewn closed with a woman still alive inside it, still breathing, still able to feel the rough canvas against her skin and the weight of the stones pressing against her body. Then the sack was carried by eunuchs to the terrace, the same terrace where the Sultan sometimes stood in the evening to watch boats pass on the Bosphorus, and thrown over the wall into the water below. The Bosphorus at that point runs deep and fast. The current pulls southward toward the Sea of Marmara with tremendous force. A weighted sack sinks within seconds. The women inside had time to feel the cold water rush through the weave of the canvas. Time to feel their bodies pulled downward by the stones. Time to understand that the surface was moving away from them and that no one was going to pull them back up. Drowning in an enclosed space takes between 2 and 4 minutes. The brain remains conscious for most of that time. Modern neuroscience confirms that drowning victims experience a cascade of panic, suffocation, and finally a reflexive inhalation of water that fills the lungs with fluid. There is nothing quick about it. There is nothing painless about it. 280 women experience this in sequence, one after another, sack after sack, over the course of a single night. Multiple sources from the period confirm the event actually happened. The Moldavian chronicler Cantemir documented it in detail. European diplomats reported it back to their governments. Ottoman court records reference it, though historians continue to debate whether the number 280 is precise or approximate. What is not debated is that it happened, that it was ordered by the Sultan, that it was carried out by the eunuchs, and that evidence was found afterward. Accounts describe fishermen in the Bosphorus pulling weighted sacks from the water for days after the drownings. Some of the sacks had torn open, bodies washed up on the shores. The scandal spread across Constantinople and beyond. Ibrahim ruled for another year after that night. His mother, Kozum, realized that her son had become completely uncontrollable, conspired with the Grand Vizier and the Janissary Corps to depose him. On August 8, 1648, soldiers entered Ibrahim's chambers and dragged him from the throne. He was imprisoned in the same rooms where he had spent 17 years as a prince. 10 days later, he was executed by strangulation with the traditional silk cord. He was 32 years old. The women who survived that night, those who had not been in the courtyard or had been spared for unclear reasons, remained in the harem under the new sultan. Ibrahim's son Mehmed IV, the same child Ibrahim had thrown into a pool. The system continued. The case continued. The drownings continued, though never again on that scale. This is what sinister empires brings you, the history they don't teach in schools. The truth about empires built on power, terror, and the bodies of the powerless. If you want more stories like this, stories that will change how you see history, hit that like button right now and share this video. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. What city are you in? Drop it in the comments. And subscribe to Sinister Empires, because this is just a beginning. There are darker stories waiting, and you won't want to miss what comes next.